What constitutes a Pokemon to be considered rare is rather open-ended and can have quite a few different meanings depending on how you interpret the word rare in a Pokemon game. Technically speaking, a legendary Pokemon can be considered rare in a Pokemon game since there's usually only one opportunity you'll have to catch that Pokemon before it's nowhere else to be found in that copy of the game. And technically speaking, the starter Pokemon that you don't pick is technically considered rare since in most Pokemon games you can't obtain the other starters. Now, I've always liked to determine rare Pokemon based off of their encounter rates in certain routes of Pokemon games. Sure, a legendary Pokemon, which you can only find one of in a game, would be considered rare as well, but for the sake of this video, let's just stick to the encounter rate when determining a rare Pokemon. Now, in case you guys aren't familiar, encounter rate means the percent chance you will encounter a Pokemon on a certain route or area. For example, let's say one route, the only catchable Pokemon on that route are Pikachu, Weedle, and Pidgey. Weedle might have a 50% encounter rate, Pidgey might have a 40% encounter rate, while something like Pikachu could have an encounter rate of only 10%. That would make Pikachu the rare encounter on this route, since you would be most likely to have a few other encounters before encountering a Pikachu. So in this video, we'll be talking about which Pokemon is the rarest Pokemon in each Pokemon game that was the first installment of their generation based off of their encounter rate, so we will not be looking at games such as Black and White 2 or Fire Red and Leaf Green, just games like Diamond and Pearl or Red and Blue. Event Pokemon, Legendary Pokemon, and any static Pokemon will be ignored as well. Some Pokemon on this list might be obtainable by way of evolution or breeding as well, but let's just go strictly off encounter rates for each of these Pokemon only. So starting off in Generation 1 with Pokemon Red and Blue, we only have 151 total Pokemon to work with. Mew is out of the question, of course, since it is a legendary Pokemon that was never properly implemented in Red and Blue, and since legendary Pokemon are out, that gives us even less Pokemon to work with. I was a little surprised to find out which Pokemon was actually the rarest in Red and Blue, and that Pokemon's actually Tauros. Tauros is only obtainable in the Sapphire Zone in 2 separate Sapphire Zone locations, with one location being a 4% encounter rate and the other chance being a 1% encounter rate. Chansey can also be found in the same 2 areas of the Sapphire Zone with the exact same encounter rates, and I thought Chansey was going to be the rarest Pokemon for Gen 1 at first. However, it can also be obtained in the Cerulean Cave with a much higher encounter rate, making Tauros the Pokemon with the lowest combined encounter rate and total locations in Red and Blue, and thus being the rarest Pokemon in Red and Blue. This was actually a little bit surprising to me, as Tauros is one of the better Pokemon in Generation 1, arguably even one of the best Pokemon when it comes to competitive battling for Red and Blue. So having it be this rare is actually kind of fitting, I guess, when you think about it like that. And moving on to Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Silver, we have a lot more Pokemon to work with as well as a lot more places to encounter Pokemon due to the fact that Gold and Silver have 2 different regions in the game. A lot of people might think Skarmory is the rarest Pokemon since it can only be found on one route that you could just pretty much ignore since it's an optional route that doesn't really add anything, you're not forced to go there in the game. It's relatively late in the game and only has a 5% encounter rate on this route, which actually isn't that bad. Surprisingly, the rarest Pokemon in Gold and Silver is actually Dunsparce of all Pokemon. Dunsparce is only found in the Dark Cave with a 1% encounter rate. I didn't expect this at all, to be honest, and it's pretty hard to verify this, but out of all of the obtainable Pokemon I've seen in Gold and Silver, Dunsparce is the only one I could see with a 1% encounter rate in any location in the game, and it can be found in only one singular location, unlike Chansey in Generation 1, which has a 1% encounter rate in one location and a higher encounter rate in Cerulean Cave. Moving on to Generation 3 with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, yet again we have a lot more Pokemon in these games, however we have less area to cover than Gold and Silver due to the fact that we only have one region as opposed to 2. This is the only one that I actually knew before making this video, and that the rarest Pokemon in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire is actually Chimecho. This makes 2 games in a row where the rarest Pokemon is rather underwhelming and not really the best Pokemon, as at least Tauros in Generation 1 was one of the better Pokemon in the game. Chimecho has only a 2% encounter rate, which is higher than the typical 1% we've been seeing, but it's only available in a specific section of Spirit Pillar towards the very top, kind of out of the way, where you don't even have to go to. They did manage to bump this encounter rate up from 2% to 5% in the remakes to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire for whatever reason, and the fact that Chimecho was such a rare encounter in an obscure part of that area makes it one of the more interesting Pokemon on this list. I remember as a kid when I first heard about Chimecho, I didn't even know what it was because it was so rare, and kids in my class would be able to find it and show me how to find it, and I finally was able to catch one, which I would not have ever realized if I didn't go to that one specific part of Spirit Pillar. For Diamond and Pearl and the Sinnoh region, we have a Pokemon that has such a bizarre way of encountering it. In Diamond and Pearl, in order to catch a Phoebus, you must fish on one of 4 specific tiles in Mount Coronet, where Phoebus has a 50% rate to be encountered. This doesn't sound that bad, as 50% is actually a pretty high encounter rate, but you have to know where these tiles are, and all these 4 tiles are different in each copy of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl that you have. This means that in a casual playthrough, you will most likely never find a Phoebus, and you really have to go out of your way to find a Phoebus even if you know about the 4 random tiles. Finding these 4 random tiles in Diamond and Pearl pretty much comes down to just trial and error, which only makes it harder to obtain a Phoebus in these games. Let me know in the comment section down below if you've ever caught a Phoebus in Diamond and Pearl, as well as if you were even brave enough to attempt shiny hunting a Phoebus in these games. For 5th generation, we'll only stick to Black and White 1 for Unova. I know technically Black and White 2 added a few more towns, so maybe you guys could consider a different region in that aspect. And if you guys want to make a follow-up video, making a video like this about games like Black and White 2, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, etc., maybe I can do it. Anyway, for Black and White 1, the rarest Pokemon to encounter is actually a Dragonite. This is the first time you can catch a Dragonite in the main series Pokemon games, unless you count Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness. However, it isn't very easy. Dragonite only has a 1% encounter rate when using the Fishing Rod in Dragon's Bile Tower after obtaining the National Dex, and on top of that, it can only be fished in rippling water, making it such a pain to catch. Luckily, if you are lucky enough to manage to find one of these Dragonites, it will be between the levels of 50 and 70, which is a nice reward, but if you really want a Dragonite, you're probably better off just getting a Dratini, which has a much higher encounter rate, and then leveling up to evolve into a Dragonite. I think it's really cool that Pokemon like Dragonite can be caught like this regardless, and it's probably one of the more interesting Pokemon of this entire list. Generations 3, 4, and 5, they went a little bit crazy with some of these encounters, and in X and Y they calmed down a little bit. This one isn't as exciting as the other regions, and there might be other Pokemon with low encounter rates like this, but in Kalos you can catch an Abomasnow in Route 17 with only a 1% encounter rate. I really don't understand why they gave Abomasnow such a low encounter in this game, as you can just catch a Snover on the same exact route with a much higher encounter rate and just evolve that. I'm guessing that since Route 17 is a snow-covered route, they made Abomasnow such a rare encounter, since it's the closest thing we have to a Yeti in Pokemon, and encountering an Abomasnow on this route would be like encountering the Yeti in real life or something like that. I don't really understand. Abomasnow also received a Mega Evolution in X and Y as well, and the funny thing about the Mega Stone is it's given to you by an Abomasnow in Snow Cavern, where Abomasnow isn't even catchable. In Pokemon Sun and Moon and the Alola region, we only have a couple of Pokemon that be considered rarest based on encounter rates, thanks to things like SOS calls from wild Pokemon summoning other Pokemon to their aid. I'm gonna have to give the rarest Pokemon title in Sun and Moon to Salamence, since it's only catchable in this game by being called from an SOS via Bagon with a 1% chance to be called, and to encounter a Bagon in the first place on Route 3 in the Alola region, you only have a 1% encounter rate, which is the only route you can find Bagon in the game. That's 2 1% chances just to catch a Salamence, which is ridiculous. Sure, you could just have a little bit of an easier time by catching the Bagon and leveling it up, but if you really want to catch a Salamence, just a Salamence, and not have to level up at all, this is your only chance. I think this is one of the more cooler encounters in all of these games, as it's actually a really good Pokemon that has 2 1% that need to happen in order to even find it. Some honorable mentions for the rarest Pokemon can go to Munchlax in Diamond and Pearl, which can only be found on certain trees using honey and not on any other route in the grass. Chansey in Red and Blue, like we discussed earlier. Phoebus in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, which you could actually argue is rarer than Chimecho, since it has a very similar encounter rate as it does in Diamond and Pearl with the random tiles. And finally, Cryogonal in Black and White. Cryogonal is only found in Twist Mountain, and it depends on which season and which part of the cave you're in order to catch Cryogonal. It's usually a 1% encounter rate in parts of the cave, within winter going up to 5%. And those are some of the rarest Pokemon that you can encounter in each region. There might be a few Pokemon you can argue can contest some of these Pokemon as the rarest Pokemon in each region based on the encounter rate, as some regions have multiple Pokemon with only a 1% encounter rate, and of course I could have missed some, as it's kind of hard to find specific encounter rates for specific Pokemon for every single game. You could also easily make the argument that Pokemon like Mew are the rarest Pokemon in Generation 1 or something like that, since there is not a really unobtainable way to get Mew in Red and Blue without glitching, and the legendary Pokemon are rare since there's usually only one copy per game, but like I said earlier, we're just going to stick to encounter rate. The concept of rarest Pokemon is open for interpretation, so I'd like to hear what you guys think are some of the rarest Pokemon in each Pokemon game. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I will see you all next time, and bye bye.